a Netflix original film.
The Wi-Fi isn't working.
In the event of a global communications breakdown, do the following. Stay inside.
What just happened here is happening everywhere.
Avoid strangers.
We've all been deserted.
I don't trust them.
And most importantly, do not panic. Julia Roberts.
What happens next?
Mahershala Ali.
I knew something was coming.
Leave the World Behind. Rated R. Now playing only on Netflix.
When Jonathan Dekel-Chen goes to Washington these days, and he goes to Washington a lot, he brings photos. Mostly they're pictures of his 35-year-old son, Sagui. He wishes he could bring more.
A lot of the photos that we had for Sagui and for all my other kids and grandkids were burned on October 7th. It was not just a murderous rampage and hostage-taking. It was full-scale looting and destruction.
Jonathan and his son are American citizens, but they lived on an Israeli kibbutz, Nir Oz. When Hamas fighters invaded, Nir Oz was one of the first places they went. Sagui has been missing ever since.
I'd love to share all kinds of photos. Him as a little boy, as a baseball player. He was one of the few Israelis who actually knows how to play baseball by virtue of my addiction to the sport. And he bought into it, thank goodness, when he was a boy, so I'd have a playmate.
That's dedication. Baseball game takes some time.
It sure does. And he caught the bug.
This is the Sagui Jonathan wants lawmakers to know. The Sagui who is so much more than a photo on a missing poster. Not just a baseball player. He played on Israel's junior national team as a kid. He's also a tinkerer. He fixed broken down farm equipment by hand. And Sagui's a dad to 2 little girls, with a third on the way. On October 7th, he locked his wife Avital and his kids in a safe room, and he tried to defend his farm. When the day was done, he'd gone missing. The only reason his father knows Sagui was taken is because other hostages, people who've been released, have seen him. But that was weeks ago. So now, Jonathan's going door to door with politicians in Israel, in the U.S., to plead his son's case, urge them to send in the Red Cross to make sure Sagui's okay, urge them to bring Sagui home. After showing them pictures, Jonathan likes to leave mementos behind, one of those missing posters of his son, and a pair of these dog tags the hostage families have been handing out.
Which I think is a powerful symbol of humanity, really, more than anything else.
The dog tags say bring them home, right?
In English, yes, they say bring them home. And then in Hebrew, there's something else, Halev Sheli Ba'aza, which in translation means my heart is in Gaza.
Two months in, do you feel more or less optimistic about your son's fate?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. For nearly 2 months, we didn't know if he was alive. We know that he was taken captive after a battle on the kibbutz in general and in and around his house specifically. We didn't know if he was alive. So the mere fact that as of, let's say, 2.5, 3 weeks ago, we know that he was alive, that is an enormous, enormous source of strength for us and hope. But as I say, with the passage of time, that's certainly nothing is for certain.
Today on the show, one family's hostage story. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
This episode is brought to you by Planned Parenthood. We all lead different lives, which means we have different needs when it comes to healthcare. Today and every day, and because of supporters like you, Planned Parenthood is committed to ensuring everyone can get the care they need to thrive. The abortion bans sweeping the nation are about control. But no one, not a judge, a politician, a family member, or a complete stranger, should be able to control your decisions about your body, your life, or your future. Together, we can reclaim our rights and restore access to safe, legal abortion. Visit PlannedParenthood.org/future.
This show is brought to you by Discover. You know, in today's world, it can seem that the best treatment is reserved for only a few. Well, Discover wants to change that by making everyone feel special. That's why with your Discover card, you have access to 24/7 live customer service, as well as $0 fraud liability, which means you're never held responsible for unauthorized purchases. Finally, no matter who you are or where you are in life, you'll feel special with Discover. Learn more at discover.com/creditcard. Limitations apply. Jonathan, you're an American citizen. Can you tell me the story of how you ended up moving to Kibbutz Nir Oz?
I grew up in semi-rural Connecticut, small town. I grew up in a community that mostly was not Jewish, but it had a strange characteristic that a fairly large number of Holocaust survivors and refugees from Nazi Germany settled there both during and after the Second World War. And my parents were among them. My mother was a little girl when her family was miraculously able to escape from Nazi Germany in 1940. And my dad was a hardcore Holocaust survivor, having survived 6 years in Nazi labor camps and concentration camps. So all of us kids of these Holocaust survivors grew up with a very strong Jewish identity. In my case, it manifests in this idea of eventually going to Israel and helping build what was a Jewish state, and graduated high school and went on my way.
What did Kibbutz Nir Oz offer to you? Like, what did you love about it? What did your son love about it? Because he must have loved it because he stayed.
He very much loved it. It's a way of life. A kibbutz, of course, for those listeners who don't know, it's a small cooperative farm. In our case, it's a community of about 440 people, multi-generational, in which it's a shared fate and a shared life.
You pool your resources.
Yes, and certainly in 1982, when I wound up there, it was very much that. It was a classic conventional kibbutz where you shared your resources. Life, that was very thin in the creature comforts, but that absolutely spoke to me because it was just this combined effort to make the desert bloom and to be there for one another in a very positive way, in a multi-generational way.
Did you grow things?
Oh, most definitely. Yeah. I've held a series of jobs, and after my mandatory army service, I became a kind of what I would hope to be an expert in irrigation, and after that into agricultural machinery. And Sagui was one of my 4 kids. He really grew up in the agricultural machine shop and sort of being my tag-along in the fields, supervising and servicing agricultural machinery. Our kibbutz is really cutting edge in terms of, or was until October 7th, a very cutting edge, high-tech agricultural enterprise. In his professional life, he has really manifested that love of building things. His pet entrepreneurial project with his wife is to take old buses and refurbish them into usable objects. And the morning of October 7th, he was actually doing that work. It was a Saturday morning, also a holiday morning, and was his practice. He kissed his wife and girls good morning and went off to the kibbutz machine shop, which is about 250 yards from his home. And his intent was to continue working. He had 2 of those buses he was working on simultaneously to convert into classrooms when he first spotted a group of heavily armed terrorists that had penetrated into the kibbutz.
Yeah, I know that you were not there on the kibbutz on October 7th, but that Sagui was one of the first people to send out a message to the group chat saying there are gunmen here.
Yes.
As a resident, did you get that message from your own son? Is it how you learned what was going on?
Well, I was in Baltimore on my way to an academic conference that day. We were woken up, myself and my wife, we were woken up early in the morning at about 6 a.m., woken by a friend in Boston who had been seeing on the news that something really bad was happening in the region of Nir Oz, and she asked us if we knew what was going on. Of course, I had no idea what she was talking about, but very quickly, once I turned on my phone, I did see what was going on. We have in the kibbutz a kind of group chats through WhatsApp, and there were multiple chats going on.
So you had this like live documentation.
Yes. Yes.
How awful to read through it.
The worst moment of my life up to that moment. Yes. I immediately called first my daughter, who also lives on the kibbutz, one of my kids. I have a son and a daughter who live on the kibbutz with her young family. They were able to pick up had a very brief conversation with her husband, actually. They were all sheltering in their attached bomb shelters. And he basically gave me the quick rundown that the kibbutz is under assault, and there were literally terrorists outside their door.
When did you realize what had happened with Sagui?
Well, I asked my son-in-law, Yossi, if he knew anything about Sagui, and he said that they had lost contact with him at around 9:30 that morning, so roughly 2.5 hours.
Your heart must have stopped.
My world stopped at that moment. We also didn't really know what was happening with his wife, with Sagui's wife, Avital, and the 2 little girls. So we didn't know if they were alive until much later that afternoon.
When the dust settled after the attack, Jonathan was able to piece together just how devastating it had all been for the kibbutz and for his family. His ex-wife, the mom of his kids, had been injured and kidnapped, but she managed to escape right before being taken into Gaza. His daughter and her family survived. Jonathan says Sagui disappeared while fighting off Hamas militants. Of the 400 residents of Nir Oz, around 20 were killed, and an estimated 80 were taken as hostages.
The reason they were able to take so many, we've now sort of in the forensic thinking about all of this, the reason they were able to take so many of us was because the IDF never came.
Because hostages from Nir Oz made up such a large proportion of those who were taken on October 7th, they also made up a significant proportion of those who were released in November during the temporary ceasefire. And I know that you weren't expecting your son to be among those released because he's a man of fighting age who had indeed fought with Hamas. But can you tell me about that moment when you learned that people from your community would be returning? You must know these people quite well.
Let me frame it this way. First, I was thrilled. These were my friends. Some of them had been my co-workers over the years. Young women who I had seen grow up. They're the age of my kids. Little ones who were dear friends of my grandkids on the kibbutz. So I couldn't have been happier at that moment. And recognizing that the alternative was much worse. The second worst moment of my life so far was eulogizing a few days after October 7th, eulogizing at the funeral a family of 6, the Siman Tov Kedem family.
The entire family?
Grandmother, her son, his wife, and their 3 little children. They were all dear friends, dear friends. They were my kids' friends. They were my grandchildren's friends. The father was shot outside of his home. The mother was shot through the door. They couldn't open the door. Then they set the house on fire, the terrorists.
And that's how the children died?
The 3 little kids most definitely died of asphyxiation. And I was asked to eulogize them because of my closeness with all the family. And Carol, the grandmother, has been my friend since 1981. An American citizen, by the way, from Philly.
How did you begin to do that?
I couldn't write a word. I tried the night before, and I couldn't write a word. I don't know. It's kind of a blur, to be honest with you.
It sounds like what you're saying is that when you got the news that many hostages from your kibbutz would be released, your gratitude was partially about, I don't have to do another service like that for these people.
That's right.
And I'm so grateful.
I think you're expressing exactly, because there were entire families who were taken and or murdered. There could have been more and there still may be more funerals like this. We've already gotten death notices about people that we believed were hostages, but over the course of the last 2 weeks, we've gotten notification from Hamas that they're dead.
And you must, of course, think of your son, too.
Every day, every minute. Again, I do know as of about 2.5 weeks ago that he is alive, but every moment that passes, who knows? They're not receiving medical care. There are bombs falling around them. So there is a real feeling of distress amongst any hostage family, any and all.
We'll be back after the break. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI. This episode is brought to you by SAP. First, the bad news. SAP Business AI will not help you generate cubist versions of your family's holiday photos, but it will help you understand which supplier is best to help you roll out your plant-based packaging in Southeast Asia, or identify the training your junior project manager needs to rise up the ranks, or automate repetitive tasks while you focus on big innovations. So you can be ready for the next opportunity. Revolutionary technology, real-world results. That's SAP Business AI.
Hi, I'm Janae Desmond-Harris, Slate's Dear Prudence. I'm dropping in to tell you about a special discount offer on Slate Plus. For a limited time, you can start a subscription for just $5. That's right. For just $5, you'll get 3 months of ad-free listening on every Slate podcast, member-exclusive episodes and segments on shows you love, like this one, and unlimited reading on the Slate site. Best of all, you'll be supporting Slate's independent journalism. But hurry, this offer ends soon. Get 3 months for just $5 by signing up today at slate.com/podcasts plus. That's slate.com/podcasts plus.
Around the same time Jonathan was in D.C., meeting with U.S. officials to push for the release of his son, a very different meeting was taking place in Israel. A group of hostage families and released hostages themselves were meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet to discuss bringing more hostages home. But leaked audio from this meeting shows it was tense, with family members shouting at the prime minister.
אז בואו, תגיד לי מה אני אמורה להגיד לאמא שלי. מה אני אמורה להגיד לה? כי לי אין לי דרך לנחם אותה.
One family member described the meeting to the press, saying it was a model of how the country of Israel is run. We were invited for 3:00. They showed up at 3:45. They got us mad, and we fought amongst ourselves.
Look, these are desperate times for hostage families. I think magnified by the fact that we're getting now direct testimony, eyewitness testimony from the hostages who have returned about how horrific the conditions are. As far as our government is concerned, keep in mind, this is a known fact. That meeting only happened, meaning the war cabinet led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, that meeting only happened because of a public shaming the day before by a group of hostage families in a very well televised press conference, demanding a meeting. And we all are perfectly aware that in the first few days of the IDF assault, Prime Minister Netanyahu and others did not say much of anything about the fate of the hostages. He and others were forced to do so by the public outcry, led by the hostage families, of course.
Hundreds of people have gathered in central Tel Aviv for the biggest protest so far in support of the hostages and their families. And they're calling on the Israeli authorities to get their loved ones home from Gaza as soon as possible. They're calling on them to make it their top priority.
Now, when we've met with the entire cabinet, what we've heard is that taking down Hamas and bringing the hostages are as important, are equally important. This is incredibly disappointing because people are dying. We know that for sure.
And so there's not a lot of good news coming out of Israel in terms of the solidarity between the hostage families and our leadership.
Hamas has detained some hostages in previous conflicts for years.
That's right.
Are you preparing for that in some way? Like, how do you even prepare for that?
I don't think about that. That's not what I intend to happen. And I think all of the hostage families, of course, were painfully aware of that history. And we're doing everything we can to make sure that that does not happen.
Yeah. You know, I wanted your perspective on something because I've had a number of guests on my show who've said they don't believe the destruction of Hamas is possible. They think the idea of Hamas, the idea of this struggle, whether it's, like the military, actual militarized group, or the idea it's so embedded at this point that its elimination just isn't going to happen. And I know you've said that is what you need to happen here. So when you hear someone say this goal is not possible, what do you think?
Look, ideologies and fanaticism and hatreds are extremely difficult to eradicate. It's a long-term process, mostly through education, which isn't instantaneous. I have no illusions that religious fundamentalism of all kinds, not just Muslim, is very difficult to defeat or very difficult to eradicate. That is simply true, and I would not argue against that. But there's a different truth here, which is we've reached an inflection point in which that can no longer be tolerated because this is the price. This is the price, this kind of savagery that was perpetrated on October 7th. What I would hope could happen here, and they must not allow Hamas, this kind of governing authority that planned, funded, and executed this massacre and this mass hostage taking, they cannot allow for the good of the world to be victorious.
There have been some hostage families who have been very explicit that they don't want their relatives' circumstances to be used as a justification for mass death in Gaza. How do you think about that? About your son's safety, about the calls to not eliminate so many thousands of people at this moment?
Yeah, well, I wish none of this were happening and none of it were necessary. And I agree with those voices coming from the hostage families. Not in his name, not in Sagui's name. Do not do this. Don't pretend that, this is happening solely because of the release of the hostages. The war aims and the execution of the war, have their own motives and their own justifications in the eyes of our own leadership, Israeli leadership. Israel's leadership has a moral and political responsibility to get these hostages home that is completely separate from the conduct of this war. Clearly, there's been a lot of loss of Palestinian lives over the course of the last 2 months. I don't think you'll find a hostage family that rejoices in that. Absolutely not. And I absolutely agree with them. Don't be doing this in the name of my son. You have no right to do this. What needs to be done to Hamas, needs to be done, but not in his name. He would never agree to that either.
I worry for you, though. I worry because your son's still in Gaza, as far as we know. I think some would worry that his life is on the line as bombs fall. And it's a terrible potential price. And I know you must think about that every day.
I think about it all the time. And hence, I and many other hostage families are demanding from our government, for the Israeli government, to do everything now, whatever their other war goals might be, to do everything now to get the hostages home. And logic would dictate that the surest way to get them home is through some kind of negotiated process now. Look, my end game is, and I'm sure it's similar to all other hostage families, is for Sagui to walk down, and I dearly hope he can walk on his 2 feet, to walk down some hallway or into some room, and his 2 little girls will leap into his arms, and he will, well, I don't know if it'll be before or after Avital gives birth, because it's any minute now, and he will meet his infant daughter. And I'm willing to do anything and demand everything for that to happen for Sagui and the other 130 some odd hostages.
It sounds like you picture exactly what it'll be like.
I think everyone has that. All of the hostage families and their loved ones have a picture in their mind of what they're working towards. Because the alternative is horrendous, unspeakable.
Yeah. You just did it there, but I do want to make sure that however we end this interview, we return to your son and his humanity and all of the joy he brings you. I was noticing that most articles about Sagui are accompanied by the same image.
Yeah.
He's very handsome. He's like bathed in sunlight. He's got this smile. It's just like lighting him up from inside. Can you tell me about this image and how it became the one you shared?
It is a very, very characteristic photo of Sagui. The light shines out of him. He's hard-nosed, but he is probably the most optimistic person, or certainly among the most optimistic people I've ever met. He really does believe that if you do, and quite literally with your hands, do the right things, life will improve for people who you know and people who you don't know. I mean, in a way, he's, kind of the living definition of altruism, doing stuff for people that you don't even know. He lights up a room. He lights up every space. I don't know of a single person who has not met him and come away feeling that the world's a better place because people like Sagui are in it.
Jonathan, I'm really grateful for you taking so much time and telling your story in such depth. Thanks for doing it.
I appreciate your willingness.
Jonathan Dekel-Chen is a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the father of Sagui Dekel-Chen. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osborne, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. We are led by Alicia Montgomery with a little boost from Susan Matthews. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate, and I'm Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time.
Trying to grab all the groceries in one trip? Oof, not how you would have done that. You know sometimes less is more. Like when you drive less and save with the USAA annual mileage discount. USAA. Get a quote today.